So July is unfortunately my worst reading month of 2026 so far, by about 1,000 pages actually, which is quite significant, but I did enjoy a few of the books that I read in July, so at least we have that. I honestly don't really know what happened in July. I read a couple of books throughout the month that I felt really held me up, and I guess I had a little bit of a mental health dip towards the end there, which when I'm feeling like that, sometimes I can really struggle to read. So weirdly, unfortunately, I only managed to finish 5 books in the month of July, which, you know, is not an insignificant amount, but compared to what I typically read, it is quite a bit less. And the interesting thing about it as well is that throughout the entire month, I felt like I was reading, but apparently I wasn't. The statistics prove otherwise. Getting into those statistics, in the month of July, I read a total of 2,188 pages across 5 books, which breaks down to an average of about 71 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 2 3 stars, 2 4 stars, and a 5 star, which breaks down to an average of 3.8 stars per book. For the demographics, all of the books that I read this month were adult. For the formats, 3 of them were standardly formatted novels and 2 of them were ebooks. For the genres, we had 4 fantasy and 1 romantasy. For the places where I sourced these books from, 2 of them are books that I bought new. 1 was a book that was gifted to me, 1 was from a subscription box, and 1 was from Kindle Unlimited. And in terms of how long these have been on my TBR, 2 of them were from my existing TBR prior to the start of 2026. 2 of them are books that I've hauled this year, and 1 of them is from my digital library, which is of course that Kindle Unlimited book. Speaking of KU, the first book that I read in the month was Spark of the Everflame by Penn, which is the one book that I don't own physically. Although, if the rest of the series goes the same way as this one, I may find myself needing to invest in copies of this series, because this one is a very popular romantasy book. It is the first book in the Kindred's Curse saga, and we're following a young woman called DM who lives in this world that is ruled by the descendants of the gods. All of the different areas of this world have very different magics, and the magic of the place where DM lives is split between light and shadow, and every area of the world has these 2 different types of magics that kind of balance each other out. And the world of the Descended and the world of the humans is very separate. The Descended are considered superior to humans, and DM is working as a healer. Her mother is also a healer, and she has forbidden DM from ever having anything to do with or any contact with the Descended. However, one day her mother goes missing, like completely without a trace, right at the beginning of this book, and DM is kind of forced to step up and take over her mother's responsibilities, treating the Descended in the palace, especially when there is an accident and healers are called in to help with the people who are injured. So this throws her into this new world a little bit as she gets to know some of the Descended, and also reveals a lot about her mother that she had no idea about. And then while she's at home, she's finding that her loyalties are tied between these new people that she's meeting and interacting with and maybe getting to know and like a little bit, and the people who are at home who have a very different view of the Descended than maybe some other people in this world. I was very cautious going into this one because I know how popular this series is, and sometimes hyped books, especially hyped romantasy, don't really work for me. So I don't like to go in with super high expectations and then leave myself open to disappointment, but I was very pleasantly surprised by this one. I'd heard that the character of DM was a very frustrating one to follow, and I can definitely understand why people feel that way. She is impulsive, she doesn't think through her actions, she describes herself as being somebody who is very fiery, she has a bit of a temper, she always stands up for herself, maybe she's a little rash in her anger. I think she's described as having anger issues as well, but one of the main issues I had with her character throughout this is her complacency and the way that she was going along with things that she didn't necessarily agree with, but also things that she thought were outright wrong, to be able to conform to a part of this society that actually I don't really feel like she had any business interacting with based on the events of this book. That being said, she actually didn't irritate me too much. While I did find her character flawed, I am interested to see how she progresses throughout the rest of the series in that regard, because I think it's maybe a little bit downhill from here. The interesting thing about this one is that I don't feel like Penn Cole is doing anything new within the realms of romantasy. This is a very typical story, very typical characters, very typical romance for the genre, but something about it is very compelling. I think Penn Cole does put a little bit of her own spin on it, and I ate this one up. Honestly, I really enjoyed the tension that we had within the plot as well. I do feel like some of the plot twists were obvious, like I could see them coming a mile off, just because I've read so much of this genre, which is why I said it wasn't necessarily pushing the boundaries of the genre. But I do feel like we had a couple of surprises in there. I think that even though I knew what was coming, Penn Cole did a good job of maintaining that tension. And I also am invested in the romantic relationship, which I really liked that we had a slow burn throughout the romance in here. It is not something that is kind of like a done deal by the end of book one, and we're going to go into book two tackling the plot together but madly in love with each other. The romance at the end of book one is not established, which I really liked, because I find that with stories of this nature, when we relieve some of the tension, especially within that relationship, I lose a lot of interest. So I'm really glad that Penn Cole maintained that throughout this, but also with the intention to maintain it into the sequel. And yeah, overall really enjoyed it. I'm hoping to pick up book two very soon actually, and I think I'm gonna have a good time with that. I'm genuinely enthusiastic about continuing this series. One of the books that held me up this month was very unfortunately The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne, which is the final book in the Bloodsworn saga. This one is John Gwynne's Norse mythology inspired series, and it is adult epic fantasy following a handful of characters who, the one thing that they have in common from very early on in this series is that they are all looking for missing children. There is a lot more going on than just the disappearance of children, and a lot more that binds these characters together, but that is the one goal that they all share throughout the first book, because this is one of those series where you only really become accustomed with the actual plot as you get to the end of the first book. But it is set in a very magical world where there was a legendary war between the gods, and they all killed each other during this war, and there is a sacred battleground where all of their skeletons lie, which is now just thought to be a myth. We also have like spirits of the forest, there are like small gods or lesser gods, and we also have people in here known as the Tainted who are enslaved in this world, and they are people who contain the blood of the gods, obviously to a lesser degree. As we start this series, we have a lot of turmoil in the world because a lot of these smaller communities are banding together to pose a bigger threat or a bigger resistance against other territories that may try to invade and claim them, which I mean very common for the assumed historical time period that this series is set in. And we discover throughout this series the lengths that humans will go to claim and then also hold on to power. So this final book in the series was unfortunately not my favorite. I ended up giving this one like a 3.5 star rating, mainly because I really struggled to get into it. All of the books in this series are quite a slow build, in that they all become a lot more dynamic towards the end. So every book is kind of like a slow build to a final conflict. And based on where we left off at the end of book two, and also the fact that this is the final book in a series, I honestly just felt like it took too long to get going. It took too long for this one to grip me. I feel like we had a lot of tension at the end of book two. We were kind of on the precipice of a bunch of like really interesting but also catastrophic events, and when we started book three, the tone was just a little too calm. And given that this is a very action focused series, John Gwynne participates in a lot of like historical battle reenactments, so he does have a lot of, I guess, somewhat realistic fight scenes in his books, and he also writes like warrior or heroic fantasy that do have warriors cast as the main characters in a lot of instances. So it is a series that has a ton of action scenes, and I felt like it took too long to get to the action in this one. Too long for the plot to turn to serious matters or impactful matters for the conclusion of this series. The thing that I appreciate about John Gwynne is that he's not afraid to kill his characters. That is one of the reasons why I really like epic fantasy as a genre, actually, because I really appreciate the emotional turmoil when authors aren't afraid to kill off the characters that you care about. I will say all of the casualties in this one did feel like a personal attack, and I was not happy about the choices that Mr. Gwynne made. I am generally happy about where this series resolved after all. I just felt like the end of the second book in this series was a lot more dramatic, a lot more exciting, and a lot more epic, shall we say, than book 3. So unfortunately, my least favorite book in the series. I do still really enjoy John Gwynne though, and I'm really excited to pick up his new book, which is The Wolves of War, coming in November. But at this point, The Faithful and the Fallen, which has a much slower pace and a slower build to it, is still my favorite John Gwynne book, as opposed to his faster paced series that he's written since that one. My second 4-star read for July was The Magician's Guild by Trudy Canavan. This one has been on my shelves for a really long time. I had a friend at uni who really loved Trudy Canavan, and so I picked this book up at some point when I was getting into more adult epic fantasy, but I've never actually really heard anybody talk about it until I put this on my July TBR. This is the first book in the Black Magician trilogy, and it is following a young girl who has the ability to perform magic, but that is something that is very restricted in this world. It is normally something that has to be drawn out of people. Normally an ability, you have to be taught how to use it, and then you have to join the Magician's Guild and work in service to the king. However, our main character Sonia is what is known as a wild magician, and that is somebody who has not been taught, has not been trained, and has just kind of instinctually figured out how to use magic on her own, albeit accidentally. So when the guild find out there is a wild magician on the loose, they do what they can to track Sonia down and bring her into the fold so that they can teach her control of her magic and then hopefully convince her to stay in the guild, because Sonia actually really distrusts magicians because she is somebody who is very poor and has grown up in the less affluent areas of the city where she only really sees magicians doing harm. So when I put this in my TBR, I had a bunch of comments saying that people kind of just assumed that this was a young adult series. Now, book 1 was published in 2001, before young adult was a really established demographic that publishers were intentionally publishing literature into. And so I'm not sure whether Trudy Canavan intended this to be a young adult series or aimed at younger adults, or whether it's just that Sonia is very young in this first book or this first trilogy, and so because we're viewing this story through a younger perspective, it gets miscategorized as young adult. I do see this a lot with Red Rising by Pierce Brown, if people just read book 1, and also with the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, because in those first 3 books, Fitz is very, very young, especially like at the beginning of book 1. I think he's maybe like 6 to 16 years old, and he's maybe almost 20 by the end of the trilogy. The reason why I'm not sure that this is intended to be young adult is because there is also a spin-off trilogy in this world, which once again follows Sonia, but at a much later point in her life. And the main reason why I'm unsure as to whether this is intentionally young adult is because there's actually a spin-off, like a sequel series to this one, that follows the same character of Sonia at a much later point in her life. But I really enjoyed this one. I would say my favorite thing about it is that it was compulsively readable. I honestly flew through this. It's not especially long, it's 463 pages, but honestly I couldn't put it down. If you're new to fantasy, especially like rich high fantasy worlds, I definitely recommend picking up something like this, because the information about the world doesn't overface you, it isn't overly dense, and we are primarily following this story through the lens of Sonia as she comes to terms with the fact that she has these magical abilities. If you are a fan of a magic school, this book definitely provides those vibes, although also given the title of this book and the way that the only thing I knew about this going into it is that it is a magic school series, I will say it takes a lot longer for that magic school element to come into it than I anticipated. I do think that Trudy Canavan did a really good job as well of maintaining the tension throughout the entirety of this book. As well as Sonia, we do follow a couple more characters. One of them is a thief that she is friends with from the area of the city that she comes from, and then we also have one or two of the magicians that are part of the guild, which I liked because then you not only get Sonia's perspective as a beginner and a newcomer in this world, you also get the perspective of people who are more experienced and know what's going on, which help to enrich the story by providing different information that kind of forms the whole of the plot. I like that we have themes of corruption in here, and it reminded me a lot of Arc of the Scythe by Neil Shusterman, in that we seem to have a body of people who all do the same thing, which would be the Magicians Guild in this and the Scythedom in Arc of a Scythe, but we have different philosophical approaches to this job, and these are people who are supposed to provide a united front. They're supposed to represent this sect of the world, but within their ranks there is division and also a level of corruption, as people believe that there are different ways to achieve their ends, all at different points on the scale, like morally and ethically. So I'm really excited to continue on with this series as well. I could have gone straight into book 2 off the back of book 1, honestly. And the only things that I personally felt that this one was lacking was maybe a little bit more surprises in the plot, especially as we would draw into the end of this one. And also at this point, I'm not sure what the scope of the plot is, like in terms of epic fantasy. I don't know whether this series truly fits into that genre because I don't know how big the plot is going to expand as a whole, but 4 stars and would definitely recommend trying this one out. If my 5-star read of July surprises you, do not worry, because nobody is more surprised than me that I loved Stay for a Spell by Amy Coombe. I picked this one up during an episode of Shelve It or Scrap It, honestly because I thought it was going to be an easy scrap. Generally speaking, nothing about cozy fantasy appeals to me. As you can see, a common theme throughout this video is that I like my fantasy plot lines to be epic. I like the stakes to be high. I want people to die. I want to be worried for our characters. And cozy fantasy, you know, it doesn't contain any of those things. So typically when reading the genre, while there's a couple of books I've enjoyed, I'm generally really quite bored, and I did not expect this to be an exception, but this one thoroughly charmed me. So this one is following a princess who hates being a princess. She is a people pleaser and she will do anything that is asked of her. All she wants to do though is just sit and read her book. So her parents have given her the responsibility of being the person who travels throughout the country and performs all of the open ceremonies and blesses the unicorns and kisses the babies. And our main character, being agreeable, she goes along and she does just that, and she enjoys that she gets to read so much in the carriage rides between places. And one day she realizes on one of these trips that she's run out of reading material, so she heads into this local bookstore to pick up some books, and she is cursed by the current owner of the bookstore to remain in the shop until she achieves her heart's desire. So our main character is a little bit like, oh no, like I'm really going to disappoint people because I'm trapped here and I have places I should be. But honestly, she's relieved to be able to kind of set aside her duties as a princess, and her parents, upon finding that she's locked in this bookstore, send the 7 princes of the realm to try out True Love's Kiss to see if they can break the curse. Meanwhile, our main character is just spending her time running a shop and having a grand old time, if I'm being honest. So this one shouldn't have worked for me for a number of reasons. One of those is that it really just goes into the mundanity of running a bookshop. Like, we're working on window displays, we're writing down our accounts, we're spring cleaning and reorganizing the shelves. I ate that up. and I don't know why. I loved it so much. I don't know whether it like really satisfied the part of me that really liked playing the Open for Business expansion of The Sims 2 for like years and years and years, but something about it just really felt like it was scratching an itch for me. This is set in a fantastical world that isn't really explained because it isn't mainly just a backdrop for this more cozy, heartwarming story of our main character kind of coming into herself, learning about herself, and maybe realizing what freedom and a life outside of her duties would entail. But I really liked that it added this sprinkle of whimsy to the story. We do also have a romantic plotline in here as well with a swashbuckling pirate character, and I really liked that Amy Coombs emphasized some of these elements for drama, like the swashbuckling pirate comes in a billowing shirt and leather trousers, and then this girl who works at the shop is surprised that our main character like can't tell he's a pirate. I like that we really leaned into stereotypes in that way, and I also really liked the humor as each of the main characters' interactions with these princes that have come to visit become more and more dramatic and ridiculous throughout the course of the story. The only thing that I didn't love about this is that in terms of the romantic content, it did get a little bit smutty. It didn't go too far into that, but I think cozy fantasy for me reminds me a lot of children's stories that appeal to adults. And I do feel like when we get into smuttier content within these books, it feels a little bit jarring and it feels a little bit out of place, and it does break the magic a little bit for me in that regard. So while it didn't go too far necessarily, for my personal preference within stories like this, it went a little bit further than I would like it to. Because if I compared this to any other books, I would definitely compare this to something like Howl's Moving Castle, which is literally a children's story that has a romantic plot line in it and a lot of appeal for adults. And I personally prefer it when books of this nature kind of keep that tone. I'm not opposed to smutty content at all. I read a fair amount of romance, and I also really like romantasy, obviously. But for cozy fantasy, for me, things of this tone and nature, I just prefer that they didn't lean too far in that direction. And then the final book that I read in July was the other book that I felt really slowed me down this month, and it is another actually final book in a trilogy. This one was Faithbreaker by Hannah Kaner, which is the final book in the Fallen God series. This one is set in a world that for a very long time was essentially ruled and everything was dictated by the gods, and the strength of the gods relies in how many people worship them, but also the type of worship that they receive. So if you are sacrificing to the gods, then you are creating a god that thrives in the fear of its subjects. And if you are giving offerings of like trinkets or food, then you are building a god that thrives in the devotion and the love of its subjects. And there was a war before the start of this series between the king and man and the gods of this world, and the king won. So he outlawed worship of the gods. They closed off the capital city where a lot of the shrines to the gods are to stop people from being able to feed the gods. And as a society, they're trying to move away from the gods. However, there are still people, religious people in this world, who will risk a pilgrimage into the capital city to give devotion to the gods that they used to all worship as a society. And our main character, Kissen, is a god killer, which is now a profession that is in very high demand given that the king has sanctioned the removal of all gods. One day, Kissen meets a young girl called Nara, who actually has a god tied to her, and they cannot be separated more than 20 feet without each of them experiencing deep pain. And so Kissen begrudgingly agrees to take Nara to the capital city to see if she can figure out how to tie this god to a shrine and remove his connection from Inara, which shouldn't even be possible anyway. And on the road, they meet Elagast, who is a knight that used to fight for the king, like in the war. He was the king's best friend and the king's right-hand man, and he has since withdrawn from the spotlight. He's opened a little bakery, but one day the king approaches him and asks him to head into the capital city to try and find a cure for the king's magical affliction that is slowly killing him. So obviously these three characters meet along the way. We also get the perspective of the god who is tied to Inara, and together they voyage to this city. Now, my favorite thing about this series is the writing. Hannah Keena's writing is really lush and beautiful, and her atmosphere is really rich and immersive. And there's a little phrase that I say sometimes on my channel, which is, I would read well-written shit. And that doesn't mean that the books that I'm reading are bad, but it means that if the book is well written, I don't care as much whether the plot is good, how I feel about the characters, because I just enjoy the writing so much. And I feel like that is one of the reasons why I have such a positive opinion of this series, even though I do think that the execution of the plot is lacking in comparison to the writing style of this. So stylistically, I love this series, but when it comes down to this being a story, there is just something about it that loses me a little bit. I was talking this through in the vlog where I read it, and I think I had a comment that said that it is the execution of the series that falls a little bit flat for this particular viewer, and I do agree with that. I feel like the concept of this series is strong. I especially like this concept of the gods growing in physical size as well as in like majesty with the devotion they receive, but also the way that they manifest based on the type of devotion they receive is really interesting. And this really leans into things like pagan gods, and it's also very like to things like patron saints. Like you have gods of safe harbor, you have gods of luck, you have gods of prosperity, and there are sectors of people that worship or are more likely to worship specific gods. Like the god of safe harbor is especially popular amongst sailors, and I really liked the exploration of this world, and that we had a lot of development and investigation into some of these smaller gods and the way in which they are worshipped and the kind of people that would worship them. But then sometimes I felt like we spent a lot of time diving into these little niches as a exploratory exercise as opposed to building more character connection or pursuing the plot. So I felt like I was very mentally invested in the world of this, but I wasn't emotionally attached to the characters or especially invested in the plot. Obviously, when you come to the final book in a series, that level of investment is what you want. You want the payoff to be worth the amount of time that you've invested in the series. And while I continue to enjoy the exploration of this world, especially because we go a little farther afield in this one, and I do definitely feel like this book was an improvement on book 2, which is my least favorite installment in this series, I do think that the concept of this series is a little bit more outstanding than the actual execution and delivery of this as a story. So I did end up giving this a 3.5 star rating. I really enjoyed my time reading this one. I am very interested to read Hannah Keena's new book, which I think is about to be released or has just been released, which is A Snake Among Swans, I think it's called. Especially because I love her writing so much. I feel like she's an author I'll always want to come back to sample her writing, but I am going to be looking for more plot work and also more character work, still with this really lush atmosphere and descriptive writing style, but maybe focusing on the other elements of the story a little bit more to deliver a little bit more of a complete package. So those are all of the books that I read in July. I did also start listening to Dungeon Crawler Call Book 5, which I think is The Butcher's Masquerade, but I have yet to finish that. I'm really enjoying it actually. I think that this one is currently my favorite Dungeon Crawler Call book that I've read so far. I also read quite a lot of The Rise of the Ranger by Philip C. Quaintrell, which I did finish a couple of days into August. So unfortunately, you will have to wait for my wrap up to hear about that one. But I do also have a vlog where I'm going to be talking about that book, which will be coming much sooner. Obviously, we have a lot of adult fantasy and some quite dense adult fantasy within this wrap up, especially with the books that I started and didn't finish as well, which could contribute as to why we have a little bit of a smaller selection of books to talk about today. I did find in July I was in a really big epic fantasy mood, and I feel like I've really pursued that to its extent, and I'm now in the mood for contemporary romance. So we'll see, because I still have a couple of epic fantasies queued up. I'm also currently reading Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This is truly my year of getting back to adult epic fantasy, and I'm really not mad about it. I'm having a really good time, but I may be looking to mix that up a little bit. And I've also put a bunch more romance into the stacks, so hopefully the next episode of Shelve It or Scrap It will help to satiate my cravings in that regard. But down in my comments, let me know if you've read any of these and what you guys thought of them. Alternatively, let me know what your favorite book of the month was. Mine was, of course, my only 5-star read, and also The Big Surprise, which was Stay for a Spell by Amy Coombe. And if you guys would like to let me know that you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, then leave me a cat emoji for the little bookshop companion that we have featured in this book. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon, and a bunch of other stuff if you want to check that out. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.